The three female teenagers from the Islamic faith in East London have travelled to Turkey, as we all know, which has been in the news, with claims to join ISIS. How worrying is this trend of radicalization? It's not just males, it's women as well in this country who want to join ISIS.
We really do have to think very carefully and much more widely about this. These were three young women who, well, girls really, I mean they're 15, not, no more, but they were, by all accounts, very intelligent, grade A students, who one assumes must have been groomed online to do this. But then there are very serious questions that have to be asked, and I think in the media lately these issues have been fudged to a certain extent. Very serious questions that need to be asked about what is happening both within the community itself that is not educating its young people about the threat of online grooming. That's not, particularly in this case, where you had a situation that one of their friends had already gone out a few months ago.
And the police had questioned the three
indeed,
girls. They were
but
aware of them.
but what is the community? What are the imams doing and saying? What are the wider support networks within?
But what about the parents at home? Do they have to play a part?
That's the other thing I was just going to come to. It is about parents and it is about families. And families have a responsibility to know what their children are doing on the internet. They have a responsibility to be talking through all of these current affairs, uncomfortable questions with their children. If as a family you sit down and you discuss these things and you say, look, isn't it awful that your friend went to be a martyr's bride, what do you think about this? That's a way for parents.
So an open talk.
Look, nothing beats transparency. Nothing beats having that open, honest dialogue with your children. I mean, I've always, as a parent, I have 4 children, and it's always been, for me, really important that, whatever question your child asks, you answer it honestly and you answer it openly. And you try and think as a parent, what is going on in your child's world? How are they seeing things? And try and have that space within your life as a family to talk about the issues of the day. I mean, I suppose in one sense it may be easier for me because I'm a politician. So these are the political things, the features of our life that are in the newspapers are things that obviously are part of my family. But as a politician, you get very little time with your family. So
But
it's really important.
One of the girls' father said that she never spoke about any of anything to do with politics, and whatever that was discussed between her and her friends. So they had no inkling when she was leaving the house that she's heading in that direction.
Well, I'd want to ask the father, did you ever ask her? Because it strikes me that if you say to your child, it's not a matter of she never brought the subject up. That's not the issue. The issue is, did you ever bring the subject up as her parents? Did you ever say to her, look, what's happened to your friend? Do we know? Look at the danger she might be in. What do you think of this? What do you think of the whole issue of young women going and going out to be brides for these terrorists? How do you see these people? Do you understand that they're terrorists? Do you understand what they're doing? These are the things that parents need to talk through with their children. It's not enough to say, well, my child never raised the issue with me. It's, did you ever raise it with your child?
Should the authorities have acted earlier? When the police spoke to these girls in Bethnal Green last December, when a friend of theirs supposedly went to join ISIS? And what are Labour's plans to tighten the laws in this area?
The authorities, the police made an intervention because the other girl had gone. And they made an intervention, presumably, in order to find out if the friends knew anything about the girl's whereabouts. They were probably not looking at this from the point of view of, were these girls going to go as well? And so I think to try and turn around and blame the authorities in this situation is really wrong. The police are not the parents. The police are not the wider community. The police are not the imams in the mosque. It's for the community itself to be talking to its young people and making clear that these are not Islamic values. Making that abundantly clear. You know, you want your children to grow up in your faith. I want that as a parent, and I've always talked openly to my children about my Christian faith. I am absolutely sure that Muslim parents want the same for their children. But in that case, they have to talk about their faith. They have to talk about the values that are embodied in their faith, and not allow the perversion of their faith to be the only understanding that their children have of what it is to be a Muslim.
So what about the French government that seems to be tackling this issue by looking at the education system and seeing if there is a problem there, that, you know, this is where the problem lies? Should we be dealing on a similar format?
Well, look, we have in this country a system of education which sets out a national curriculum. And that national curriculum has to be followed in every school. So in every school there has to be religious education, and that religious education cannot be limited to a particular faith. So even in whether you're in a Catholic school, or whether you're in a Church of England school, or whether you're in a Jewish school, or a Hindu school, or a Muslim school, you still have to have that same teaching, those same lessons about wider religious beliefs, so that you have a respect and an understanding for each other. I think in the UK, on the whole, we have avoided the problem of religious schools becoming inward-looking and becoming totally focused on the sort of reaching for a word here, I'm not quite sure what it is, but becoming insular, isolated and bigoted. I think our religious schools on the whole do a very good job of actually turning our children outward from the position of having a strong faith themselves, but able from that strong faith to recognize the value of other faith communities and to have a dialogue with those communities. I think if you go into most faith schools, they're good schools. They're not bad schools, they're good schools. Of course, there are good and bad schools in every different walk of life, but on the whole, I think our faith schools do a good job. I think were one to say we were starting from a point of view of there being no schools, would you then introduce faith schools? Well, probably you wouldn't. You'd probably say, well, isn't it better that our children all mix together from different faiths in an education system where Muslim and Jew and Christian and atheist are all living together, side by side, learning together. I think that would be the ideal, but we don't start from there. We didn't start from that point of view. For 300 years in this country, we had Jewish schools and Christian schools. And I think it was absolutely right, 18 years ago, to decide that we should have Hindu state schools. I think that was a really positive move. Otherwise, it would have simply been discrimination. Why should there be Christian schools that are state schools? Why should there be Jewish schools that are state schools, but not Hindu schools? So I was very privileged actually to help lay the foundation stone at the Krishnavanti school in Harrow. I remember that service with great affection. And I think it was right that we took those decisions to open up state schools to religions from other faiths. But we do have to make sure that those schools are teaching the national curriculum, and they're not becoming schools of bigotry, but they're becoming schools where young people can, through the confidence of having a deep and meaningful faith of their own, then recognize the same value in others.
And how worrying is the threat from Al-Shabaab, who are responsible for the attacks at the shopping centre in Nairobi, Kenya, sending a video saying that they're going to attack shopping centres in UK, US and Canada now?
Look, Al-Shabaab, ISIL, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these are different expressions of the same disease. They are different forms of cancer. on the face of humanity at the moment. Of course it's worrying. I think what is most worrying of all is the fact that young people in this country are beginning to look at some of the extremism of these ideologies and to think that in some way it resonates with a discontent that they feel and they therefore identify with it. We need to do a lot more work with our young people, giving them hope in this country about what it is to be British, what the values of living in this country are all about, so that they see that they've got far more to gain from being part of this community rather than from seeing themselves as identifying with the people who want to attack it and undermine it.
We all know that Wembley Stadium is the home of football in the UK. But how do you see the two recent racial attacks incidents, one in Paris and one at St. Pancras, with the British footballers not letting black people onto the trains?
Look, I haven't seen the video footage of this, in fact, but the report is obviously horrific. The idea that British football, they call themselves fans. I don't think any football club would accept them as fans, and certainly I think Chelsea must be horrified to have had these people identify with them. But having said that, I think it is absolutely frightful that British citizens go abroad and chant in public that they're proud to be racist. Well, that's not what I understand British values to be, and if that's the image of our country that you want to portray abroad, then really you are deeply flawed as a human being. There's something seriously wrong with you if those are the values that you want to boast about. I just find that incredibly sad that this is the image that people have of people from this country.
The black gentleman in Paris on an interview on the British media said he would not want to stay in Britain because he finds it so racist, and he says he cannot understand how black people can live in the UK.
Look, I don't think that's a fair assessment of the UK. I think actually the reason that we have such a thriving multicultural society as we do is because most people come here and they find that British people are not that racist, that they are a pretty tolerant lot. They're a pretty accepting lot. In fact, they're a pretty welcoming lot. And I'm very proud of the way, certainly in Brent, that all the different communities work and live together. I think it's helped by the fact that in Brent we're all minorities, and when you're all minorities, well, you know that nobody can get dominance over the other, and so you know you have to get on, and that's what we do in Brent. But I think on the whole, you know, you can look back 40 years, and I certainly remember the days in the 1970s or late 1960s when there would be signs in the window that said no blacks, no Pakis, no dogs, no Irish, and that was a very, very different society in those days. We've moved a huge way in the last 50, 40 years, and I think it's hugely to the credit of Britain that it has. We've become a much more accepting society. We've become a much less hung-up society, both in our attitudes towards different ethnic communities, our attitudes towards people of different religious faiths, our attitudes to people of different sexual orientation. And that is hugely to be welcomed. We're actually a very open, a very tolerant society. And that's what we need to communicate to the rest of the world.
Much more than other parts of Europe.
Not the sort of rubbish that those football hooligans were chanting on the Paris metro.
So what are your views on the tightening of the immigration borders, you know, the immigration into the UK?
I think the government has significantly failed in what it set out to do. Because it said that it was going to, you know, reduce immigration, net immigration into the UK. It hasn't managed to do that.
Should we?
Look, I believe that what we should do is we should have a points-based system whereby we welcome people into this country who can contribute to the well-being of this country. And that's exactly the system. It took us a long time in government to do it, and I accept that, too long. But by the end of 2009, we had a points-based system in the UK where we did precisely that. So if you wanted to come here and you were qualified as an architect, and we already had too many architects, we'd say, thanks, but no thanks. But if you wanted to come here and you were qualified as a chartered surveyor or a civil engineer, and we needed chartered surveyors or civil engineers, we'd say, yeah, thanks, you've got the points. We need these different professions. Please come in and help. But it's never been about non-EU migration. Because you can have a points-based system for non-EU migration, you can't have a points-based system for EU migration. Migration from within the European Union happens under the Treaty of Rome, and that is if you're coming here to look for work, then you're entitled to do that. Here, I think we need to actually make the point that there are more British people in the rest of Europe under the Treaty of Rome, outside of the UK, looking for work, getting work, and repatriating funds to the UK as a result of that, than there are people in the UK from the rest of Europe repatriating funds back to their home countries. So we are a huge net beneficiary from this. And also, the other key point to make is that every single report that has looked, and I'm not just talking about non-EU migration, I'm talking about EU migration, that each successive wave of immigrants that have come to this country have been of net economic benefit to this country. And it includes the Poles, and it includes the Romanians. Are there problems? Yes, there are. But what are they? They are the undermining of minimum wages, minimum wage levels. Now, that's the problem of government. Government needs to be prosecuting those gangmasters and those employers who are taking people on at less than the minimum wage, not turning a blind eye to them and then saying, oh, we've got a problem with immigration. Immigration isn't the problem, it's the undercutting of wages that is the problem. And people in this country then feel very keenly that, well, look, my wage levels are being eroded, my standard of living is being eroded because people are being allowed to drop below the minimum wage and undercut me. Those are the things that we need to be conscious of.
A recent study by think tank Bright Blue found that immigration has increased terrorism in the UK. What do you make of this study?
I haven't seen the study. I suspect that the Bright Blue indicates precisely where it's come from, which is a conservative think tank. But look, if you say immigration has increased terrorism in this country, what I have to say to you is stop and think. Those 15-year-old girls were not immigrants to this country. They were born in this country, right? And what studies like that often do, and I don't know this study, I haven't read it, but what studies like that and what people who make these sorts of points often forget is that these people are born here, they're bred here, their parents may have come 40, 50, sometimes 100 years ago to this country, their grandparents, and this is now the second, the third, the fourth generation. So let's stop talking about these people as immigrants, okay? They're British. They're proud to be British, and we're proud to have a society that has these people as part of us. I'm an immigrant, right? I came from Scotland, right, into England, but I don't count myself as an immigrant, and people don't count me as an immigrant because I happen to be white. Now, somebody who is born here and happens to be brown or black or yellow is classed as an immigrant. Why? They're not. They're British, and I'm proud to have them as my fellow Brit.
What are the chances of the Labour Party winning the general elections this time in face of the mounting criticism towards Labour leadership's popularity, both Ed Miliband and Ed Balls making gaffes at conferences and TV interviews, and also the fact that David Cameron has said Ed Miliband is anti-business and has gone as far as praising previous Labour leaders Blair and Brown. So with regards to falling oil prices, lower food and retail prices in the shops, which has happened under the Conservative government, what are the chances of Labour really making it?
You know, you should never believe a politician who tells you what their political chances are. What you should do is you should go to the bookies. You should look at what Ladbrokes are saying. You should look at what William Hill are saying, right? Now, check it out. Don't take my word for it. But Ladbrokes and William Hill are saying that actually the Labour Party will have the largest number of seats after the next election. Now, why are they saying that? You've reeled off a number of criticisms that David Cameron has made of Ed Miliband. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He's fighting against Ed Miliband. Let's just talk about Ed Miliband for a moment, okay? And let's look at what the pundits have said about him. They've said that he talks funny. They've said that he looks strange. And now let's talk about the reality of things. Who had the guts to stand up against Murdoch and News International over the hacking scandal? You know, when they were hacking into dead girls' phones? Who was it that stood up and actually had the moral courage to say this is wrong and we need to do something about it? It wasn't David Cameron. It was Ed Miliband, right? Who had the guts to stand up and say the energy companies are ripping people off and we're not just going to freeze your prices for 18 months, we're going to break up the structure of the energy companies so that the transfer pricing that they're doing, which means that they show their profits and losses at different parts of the same company so that nobody can tell whether they're making a profit or not when it finally comes to you, and they can get away with it with the regulator. He said that's going to go, that's going to finish. Who was it that did that? It was Ed Miliband, okay? It wasn't David Cameron. Who was it that stood up and said, we've got a problem with generation rent in this country. We need to build homes. Was it David Cameron? No, it wasn't. It was Ed Miliband. Who was it that stood up and talked about the health service and the failure of the top-down reorganisation? Was it David Cameron? No, he started the top-down reorganisation. It was Ed Miliband. Let's look at the really big issues that this country faces. What about tax avoidance? Right? Was it David Cameron who sent back £30 million of donations to the Conservative Party from people who had dodgy Swiss bank accounts? No. He didn't send that money back. He said £30 million for my election war chest to poke fun at Ed Miliband, talking funny. Yeah, I'll have that £30 million, thank you very much. Who was it that stood up and said we actually have to do something about tax avoidance and companies like Amazon and Starbucks that are ripping this country off? It was Ed Miliband. Because, you know, what happens with these companies is that they say, we want to locate in Britain because Britain has a good legal service, good legal structure, and we know that if we've got a contract here, we can get it enforced properly through the legal system. We want to locate in Britain because it's got a good education system, and that means we can get well-qualified graduates to come in and work for our country. We want to locate in Britain because we've got a good transport infrastructure, and that means that we can disperse our goods and we can know we can get them to market. Yeah, you want all those things, but you don't want to pay for them by paying your taxes. It's not on. And the person who stood up and said it is Ed Miliband. Now, when it comes to David Cameron, you know, who has never had the guts to stand up on these issues, and Ed Miliband, I know who I back every time.
The polls are showing that Labour is trailing behind. So now Ed Miliband has suddenly got appointed John Prescott as the special advisor to climate change. Is this something that the Labour Party is worrying about losing the elections because the pollsters are showing?
The reason for appointing John Prescott to this really important position is that John Prescott was one of the original architects of the Kyoto Agreement. which addressed the whole issue of climate change and said that we had to reduce emissions back down below 1990 levels. Now, this year, there's a very, very important event, that is the Conference of the Parties in Paris, that's going to take place in December of this year, where we need to reach an international agreement on how to reduce emissions, how to get climate change down to a net zero for the latter part of this century, between about 2050 and 2070, and how we need to make sure that adaptation, so that countries who are already coping with the effects of climate change can actually have an environment that they can continue to live in. We're talking about some small island states who see their very islands sinking below the waves as the water levels rise, coral reefs being bleached, which is the loss of the fisheries that people live on, the protein that they need to survive. So there's huge and serious questions here. John Prescott, for over 20 years, has been one of the leading figures talking about climate change. And quite honestly, I think it's not surprising at all that Ed, as the person who put in as Secretary of State the first legally binding climate change legislation anywhere in the world in 2008. He was the Secretary of State who did that. There's no surprise to me that he wanted John to do it. What I'm absolutely thrilled about is that John agreed to, in effect, come out of retirement in the Lords and take up the cudgels again and do it. Because I've seen him operate in the international community. I do a lot on climate change myself.
One of your political interests is also the India-UK relations. Can you tell us more?
Oh, well, we see now India powering ahead, saying, I mean, we've just been talking about climate change. India is saying that by 2022, it's going to have, I can't remember how many gigawatts it is of solar, but it will be leading the world in solar energy. Now, these are amazing indicators of India's progress, and the transformation of the Indian economy is really critical. We will see, as that economy is transformed, changes within rural India that many governments, ever since 1947, have tried to effect. India is based around the village. India is based around those rural communities. But how appalling that in so many of those villages there is no electricity at night. Well, there's no electricity. And, you know, people are in the dark in the evening. There are not metalled roads. There are not primary healthcare facilities for young mothers. These are critical things that need to be addressed. And I think as you see that rollout of a new, greener economy, you will see India just power ahead, because you introduce electricity into the villages, and what you do is you liberate families economically, because they can then work round the clock, they can work into the evenings, they can have domestic entrepreneurial manufacture going on, and that really does empower a village, empower a family, and empower an economy.
Barry Gardiner, I wish you lots of luck, and I do hope you get elected to your seat this time once again. Thank you very much for coming to the program.